looking at some of the changes that you said that you've seen in biologics and some of the innovations that have happened in those spaces, are there any particular pivotal points in your own career, in your own research, that have helped to build your career and where you are now and where you see the future going?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the most pivotal moment was when I actually left UCL. So I left UCL in 2008. So after completing my undergraduate program, I remember speaking to Chris Mason at the time, and there were no PhD opportunities available at UCL in the stem cell therapy space that was experimentally focused. But he did point me in the direction of Loughborough University, where they were just starting a new doctoral program in collaboration with Nottingham and Keele universities. And the focus was very much on addressing, the future translational and manufacturing issues associated with cell therapies. And that was exactly what I wanted to do. And I remember going to Loughborough, having been born and bred in London and never really having left London. Going to Loughborough seemed like entering into the into the ether. But it was a fantastic opportunity. And really, for me, that was probably the most pivotal moment of my career, because I was very fortunate to be surrounded by some phenomenal mentors, supervisors, people like Professor Chris Hewitt, Professor David Williams, Professor Alvin Nino, for example, true leaders of the field, and experts in their own right, as well as being surrounded by a very strong doctoral cohort, both, peers, colleagues, collaborators. And that was really the pivotal moment. And that, for me, helped me develop my own thinking and understanding, but also the mindset and the mentality by which I think we have to approach advanced therapies. It's, for me, I think the focus has always been, this isn't really a scientific or clinical discipline anymore. I think we've demonstrated the scientific and clinical potential. The focus is very much on how we address the manufacturing and translational issues. We know the science works. We know these therapies are curative in many ways, but can we produce them at a cost that many people are able to afford? And that, for me, was the major challenge then, and I think it still is.
No, you're absolutely right. First of all, thank you for a fantastic answer, and it's really clear the impact that instrumental mentors have had, and the impact that can have, and what we need to do in the industry to be able to grow and encourage and inspire others to join us in this journey, like you've was inspired, and that you continue to inspire as well. So that's a really nice story to hear. I think as you say, there are challenges in terms of the scale and the capability for us to be able to deliver these. The feasibility has been shown. We've done that bit successfully. And the real challenge is to try and get to where we want to be. Several years ago, there was a strong belief that the cell and gene therapy industry was on the brink of an explosion, and expected to follow a similar trajectory as to what we saw in biologics. Yet, while there has been progress made, we haven't seen the same level or the rapid adoption and scale. And the widespread commercialization as a result. So, in your view, what's behind that? What's blocking us?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think we ask ourselves regularly, both in our group, but also as we're looking at the field moving forward and in the wider sector with colleagues. I think it's, in a way, I see it as a positive in many ways, because I think it was important to temper expectations from the outset. I saw some of the valuations and the money that was being thrust into the sector, perhaps too earnestly, and without significant due diligence on the manufacturing capability. And I think we're now reaping what we've sown, in that I think because of the lack of commercial success, because of the lack of manufacturing capability or development, we've seen investors kind of retract a little. We haven't seen as much progress as we would have liked to have seen. But I think this is part of the natural ebb and flow of the development of any new sector, any new industry. I mean, obviously, there was lots of hype, lots of expectation, lots of promise, 5, 10, 15 years ago. I remember, again, going back to when the Yamanaka paper was published, huge amounts of excitement. And that was obviously, Nobel Prize winning science, phenomenal. But that's exactly what it was. It was science. It wasn't necessarily you know, here is now the therapy that is going to emerge from this science. And that takes time. And I think, you know, whilst there has been limited commercial success, and I think there has been success when you look at now we have, you know, a number of CAR T products which have been approved. Yes, they may not be the highest revenue generating products, but they're certainly some of the most impactful. You know, you look at, you know, saving lives effectively. You know, from a clinical standpoint, I can't think of anything more impactful than those types of therapies, especially given the, you know, the fact that, you know, these aren't in many cases repeated doses and so on. These are curative therapies potentially for life. So I think there was a challenge and an issue that I and many others could foresee coming, which was that too much money was being pumped into the industry based purely on the scientific potential rather than the actual deliverability and the commercial and the manufacturing potential. And I think, and as with these things, there's ebbs and flows, and sometimes, you know, it's important to separate out the wheat from the chaff. And I think we're at that stage now where, you know, investors are doing more due diligence. They're focusing now more on the manufacturing capability, on the ability to deliver at scale, to deliver a return on investment. And I think we needed that. You know, it's all well and good. You know, I think the bubble has burst, but it's still something that will have significant potential moving forward. And I think, you know, I've got huge expectations and excitement about what's to come, because now I think we've all realized you have to be able to think about commercial viability from the outset, and it is refocusing the minds to address that particular point, which is, in my opinion, always been a stumbling block. I always, when I present, and I'll finish my answer on this point, when I present at conferences, I always like to show when I first joined the field, you know, back in 2007, 2008, kind of learning about iPSCs at the time and embryonics and MSCs, the focus of everyone in the sector, every conference, every meeting was, how can we get these products approved by the regulator? You know, that was the only focus. You know, regulatory approval, there had been very, very few, if any at all. I mean, there had been some tissue engineered products, some of the skin products, skin grafts that had been approved at the time, but very little else. So the focus was always, how do we get these approved by the regulator? And that was, you know, every conference you went to up until about 2015, that was always the mantra. And, you know, by, you know, 2020, we had, you know, now dozens of products approved, and even now tens of products approved, even further. So regulatory approval is no longer the challenge. You know, it's still a barrier, and obviously one that we must address, but we have a well-trodden path that we can use. The focus absolutely has to be from everyone in the sector, whether you're a clinician, whether you're an academic, whether you're in industry, whether you're in the science space, has to be, how do we make this a commercially viable industry? And that requires the input of everyone, because it is going to be a lot of focus, as I believe, on bioprocessing manufacture, but it's also going to be about the development of novel payment methods and reimbursement activity, looking at perhaps new regulatory approval mechanisms or expedited regulatory approval mechanisms, working closely with the regulator on new manufacturing paradigms. And we've seen the MHRA lead on the decentralized manufacturing approaches. So I think that has to be the focus now. I think that's probably setting in for everyone now, and that's only a good thing in my opinion. And I think we can always fall back on these therapies when they work are truly transformative.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Great answer. Thank you. And I totally share your thoughts there, that the cell and gene therapies and the potential that they've got are too great, and that it's not just an academic or a clinical challenge. Actually, there's a lot more involved to that, and we've got to consider that holistically. You would have heard me say before, but the only thing worse than not having a curative treatment is having a curative treatment you cannot access.
Absolutely.
If we create curative treatments, we absolutely have to be able to deliver them. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right to be focusing on the areas where we'll be able to transition to a scaled manufacturing capability, deliver it to every patient that needs it on a global scale. I think is a vision that we should all have, and I know you certainly do have. It is interesting that you say that there was an initial flow of investment that may have been a little bit premature. And does that leave us with a risk now, actually, that from a manufacturing perspective, that there are challenges, and so actually investment is deferred a little bit, possibly a bit too late actually. So a lot of the time, big investment companies will wait to see clinical data, first in human data. And actually, there's a lot of innovation that we can be doing in the preclinical setting. Is there anything that we can do to regain investor confidence in that preclinical setting?
Great question. So to answer the first part of the question, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think it has, investors have been burnt, and they obviously don't want to be burnt again. So they're doing a lot more due diligence, and in some cases, they may be deferring till it's too late. So, this isn't necessarily the best climate to raise or generate funds, but there are companies that are still doing it and doing it quite successfully, which is great to see as well. I think going back to your question, is there anything we can do more in the preclinical stage? Absolutely. I think, work, led by the Catapult, for example, at looking at, creating a PAT consortium, for example, to look at the role of process analytical technologies and the impact that can have on, manufacturing control, manufacturing or process understanding. For me, I think the fundamental focus should always be on, whether it's preclinical, phase 1, whatever it might be, even in early stage development. The more you can understand about your process and your product, ultimately, the better you will be placed to start thinking about transitioning between different scales, between different technologies, between different manufacturing sites, or whatever it might be. And that has to be the fundamental precursor. So anything that can enable us to achieve that, whether that be new technologies, new processes, new science, perhaps, I think the better. And I think that is what I think the sector needs to realize, is that's probably where we should be spending a lot of our time and money and effort to really enable that. And then having organizations like the Catapult or like, CDMOs who are there to be able to support early stage developers to be able to, translate their process moving forward. One thing I will say is, I think going back to that analogy with biologics, for example, whilst I think it's a fair analogy, I also think it's somewhat of an incorrect analogy as well. And I used to, always make that analogy, but having really thought about the innovation pipeline for cell and gene therapies, it's very different to biologics. Cell and gene therapies, which have been around for many, many years, have always been pioneered, and especially over the last 15, 20 years, been pioneered by clinicians. And that's the reality. The exciting science, the exciting, assets have been pioneered by clinicians. And they don't stop there, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but they've continued to then take that science and that and that exciting work into their first in human trial, they've got funding for that, and then they get maybe more funding based on that. But throughout that process, they've never had to stop and think, okay, what is the manufacturing process going to look like when we get to phase 3 and beyond? How are we going to generate a return on investment? Because that's never been the driver, and nor should it be in many instances for clinicians to think about, manufacturing processes or return on investment or whatever it might be. But when those clinicians then spin out companies and they're then doing that, and it's using, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, very rudimentary technologies, and I would argue some of them still are, then that presents the challenge. Whereas in biologics, that was never the case. A lot of the early stage development was being led by industry themselves. So, early stage companies at the time, like Amgen, Genentech, multi-billion-dollar companies now, they were developing the processes, always with kind of understanding what the manufacturing constraints and challenges were that needed to be overcome. So I think, we've kind of put the cart before the horse, I think, here, where we've got some really exciting science, and then we're just rushing through to get a product onto the market, not realizing, even if you get a product onto the market, if it's costing, $500,000 a dose, or in some cases for gene therapies, upwards of $1 million a dose, that's not going to be a financial success, and it's not going to be accessible to the patients that need them.
Yeah, no, brilliant. That's really interesting. And I totally agree with you. It's interesting to see that the development and the delivery pipeline is different, and it's got different players, different stakeholders, and different drivers. Given that, and our medicines manufacturing infrastructure is set up in a specific way, the way that it always has been, the way for producing small molecule, and it adapted well for biologics to a greater or lesser extent as well. What do we need to do differently from an infrastructure perspective, to be able to support people to be able to develop their products with good science, generate the science and the data that they need, but at the same time ensure that they can be scaled and manufactured at scale as well. Is there anything that we need to do differently?
That's probably the $1,000,000 question, but I think that there are. I mean, just a couple of examples from my side. I think absolutely collaboration at its earliest stage. So when clinical partners or academic or scientific partners have promising assets that they're developing, them having the recognition that they probably don't have all the skill sets required to translate this, so reaching out to organizations like CDMOs, or in this case, absolutely the Catapult, for example, to be able to integrate and work and say, well, what are the things that we need to consider from the outset, and what needs to be considered if we're going to develop this further? So I think that's the first thing. I think so collaboration is absolutely key. I think it's also recognition on the part of the CDMOs and organizations like the Catapult and others that clinicians are absolutely committed to their patients and absolutely committed to delivering the best scientific outcomes and clinical outcomes. And they have a passion and a drive for that. And it's important not to undermine that drive, in my opinion. I think you have to work with it. And it's about how you develop that partnership together. I think there's a lot more education that's needed around that as well, about what it actually takes to commercialize products in this day and age, in this environment. When we look back at biologics, the average lifetime of from your initial asset ideas through to commercialization and getting to market was about 10 years. That timeline for cell and gene therapies, and actually some of the other therapeutic modalities, is now much shorter. You're now looking at 5 years, which puts a lot of pressure on developers. But yet we're still expected to run through the same sort of phase, clinical trial phases. We're expected to generate similar data sets. I think there's been a lot of work done with regulators, but there's more that could be done to temper expectations in terms of clinical data required to progress through the clinical trials, simply because often we're dealing with rare diseases where there's low patient numbers, or indeed we just don't necessarily have the ability to generate or work with large patient populations at this stage, and therefore what does that do in terms of timelines and getting access to progressing the asset. But I think the other big thing that I think needs to occur is recognizing that cell and gene therapy isn't special in and of itself. And what I mean by that is we often have this mentality that our products are very different to a traditional biologic or a vaccine. And yes, there are differences in perhaps the modality or in terms of method of delivery, but in many instances, the same process understanding is required. The same manufacturing methods can be utilized. The same idea of using quality by design, for example, and designing your quality in from the outset into your product should apply to cell and gene therapy as it does to biologics. We're not immune from that. So I think it's recognizing that, and again, getting that early into the mindset of scientists, clinicians, developers from the outset.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that will have many benefits, one being in the scalability, and another will be in the affordability in that as well. Because as we know, advanced therapies do currently have, or are perceived to have, a price tag on them. So how do we balance the innovation and the affordability? And is there anything that you think that we need to be doing in the industry to make CGTs more accessible?
Yeah, great question again. So I think from my perspective, there's a lot that I think we can learn as this transcends into a global sector. So we've seen the likes of India and China really start to lead in many ways the development of new cell and gene therapies, or perhaps take a lead on low cost cell therapy production. For example, India's doing some fantastic work in low cost CAR T manufacture. You could argue that a lot of the they're building and they're standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of the work that was done by UPenn and many others over the 2010 and so on. And so therefore perhaps don't have to recoup as much in terms of the R&D costs. But still, I think there's a lot of manufacturing innovation that can be achieved when you start to think about viral vector production, whether that's for ex vivo gene modified cell therapies or in vivo gene therapies, whatever it might be, moving towards suspension platforms, moving towards rather than transient transfection, move towards stable transfection, or integrating, going back to that PAT point I made earlier, integrating more process analytical technologies, thinking about scale from the outset, rather than it being an afterthought. It's not to say, and again, I don't want to come across as being very critical of those that have developed cell and gene therapies, have done some phenomenal work over the last 5, 10, 15 years. But the point I really want to get across is that if as the asset is progressing, there is a consideration. Okay, what will it take to scale this? What will it take to, what are the considerations we need to think about very early on? What are the technologies we should be thinking about? Having that insight at an earlier stage would be far more beneficial. But the reality is that investors are putting the pressure on developers to get to their first in human, or get to their next stage, or get to their next data point. And those important kind of questions around manufacturing, scalability, sustainability, commercial viability often have to get left by the wayside because there isn't enough time, money, or effort that the company can put in to lead on that. But again, that's where, going back to that point I made earlier, collaboration, that's where organizations like the Catapult, in my opinion, should be absolutely supporting and are doing in many cases, and that needs to be more widespread. And the work that we're doing, we're trying to work with a number of clinical commercial partners who are in early stage development to think about different technologies, think about their bioprocessing from an early stage, and what it might take to translate that to a larger scale or to something that is more cost effective.
That's brilliant, and thank you. And you're right, the Catapult is we're uniquely positioned to be able to support the industry in some of these things, and as you know, I'm very driven to understand how we can leverage the capabilities and expertise that we've got to be able to drive those kind of collaborations. We should definitely connect more to understand how we can help the industry together as well. I'm conscious of time. Can I ask you 2 more questions?
Of course, go ahead.
Sure, cool. So Jevons paradox suggests that as we solve efficiencies, as we solve efficiency challenges, new constraints emerge due to the increased demand. If we're successful in overcoming today's manufacturing constraints, what's going to be the major bottleneck in the future?
Great. Yeah, I've often thought about this, not in the context of cell and gene therapy. So I'm glad you mentioned it in this context, in utilizing Jevons paradox. I think, from my perspective, I think there is a sense, and there was certainly a sense that, I've mentioned the importance of understanding your product and your process. And I think that's a never-ending story. I think, you can spend an infinite amount of time and do an infinite amount of analysis, whole genome screening, for example, on your product. And I think there's a risk that you may find things you don't want to find, or not necessarily that these have safety implications, but you can't necessarily explain why this gene is being expressed or isn't being expressed, or what does this mutation mean, or whatever it might be. And the fact is, we all have natural mutations in every, most of our cells in our bodies, but we don't know what it means. And so I think there was a risk at one point where I think, we were doing a huge amount of characterization. And I'm going back to 10, 15 years ago with a lot of the early stage MSc work. There was some fantastic work done by ethicists, really doing some really detailed screening and analysis and really characterizing their product. But I always felt that when you get to that point, the regulators always need to ask, well, what does it actually mean? And what happens if there's a slight deviation? And does that mean you can't release your product? Or, and I think there is an element of, the more efficient we get an analysis, or in the technologies for analysis, our data analysis has to improve to be able to then understand what these changes actually mean and whether there's any safety or efficacy implications. So I think there's that element. But I think from going back to your question about what the future challenges might be, I'm very keen that we just solve the manufacturing ones for now. I think that because I think if we get those, I genuinely feel if we can address the manufacturing bottlenecks and challenges, and by that I mean, can we find, and when I say manufacturing, I don't just mean manufacturing per se of the cell expansion or whatever it might be. I mean the broader sense of manufacturing, in the sense of how do you make this at a unit cost that is going to be, you know, reimbursed and that is affordable and whatever. Yeah, that's what I mean in the broader sense, kind of almost kind of connecting the business model with it. I think those are significant. Those are the significant challenges. You know, we haven't necessarily addressed all the manufacturing challenges in biologics, but we have products that are generating, you know, significant revenue, sustaining the industry, and also, you know, affordable to people around the world. That's what I would love to see for cell and gene. So I think to address that, there are going to be some unique business model or cost model challenges that we need to think about: cost pricing structures, pricing payment plans. I think we also need to think about maybe expedited regulatory pathways, but also I think we need to think about what does the future of manufacturing look like, especially now with the emergence of digital tools, AI, ML, digital twins. How can we really utilize, you know, next generation computing, next generation AI models to support not just with drug discovery, and there's a big focus on that, but I genuinely feel we can utilize these tools, and we should be utilizing these tools for next generation manufacture. You know, how do we have adaptive processes that can respond and react to changes in the culture environment automatically without any operator input and deliver an optimal outcome? And how can we do that on a routine, reproducible basis?
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I think the first point that you said around that resonated a lot with me, actually. So the ability for us to be able to create our own problems further downstream because of the data that we unlock in the process. And where we're at with precision medicine as a whole, the more that we understand about individuals, the more we understand how we can use that and target it against disease. It'll also open up a lot of other questions as well.
I think we just have to be aware that we may open Pandora's box, which may not be possible to close back again, but we want to make sure that we have the, you know, as we start to unravel or think about these questions, hopefully we're prepared for the answers that may emerge, or the understanding and the analysis and the insights that may need to be generated to answer some of those questions that start to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on some really important themes there as well: creation of digital twins and AI and the use of AI, and how we'll be able to use that in supporting developments. And we could go on for another hour simply on those things. But I'm conscious of your time, and I do thank you for being so accommodating for us. My last question is going to be where are we going to be? Fast forward is 10 years. What does the CGT landscape look like? What has fundamentally changed, and what are the challenges that we still got to hit in 10 years' time?
Great question. So I would say where I would hope we are, and where I think we might be two different answers. But I think I really do hope that we're in a scenario where we have a number of therapeutic modalities on the market. So not just CAR Ts, but everything from whether it's TILs, whether it's NKs, macrophage, gene modified stem cells, maybe. Actually, we have gene modified stem cells at the moment, but many more of them. But also, I think the idea that we've now transitioned into other types of delivery or manufacturing paradigms, so things like in vivo CAR T. So the idea of delivering mRNA loaded with lipid nanoparticles loaded with mRNA, or vector loaded with mRNA to generate in vivo CAR therapies would be ideal. So those are the kind of the therapeutic modalities I'm hoping will be on the market. But also I see the rise and the prominence of things like gene editing tools. So things like not just CRISPR and so on, but also prime and base editing. And the impact that will have on the types of therapies that we can actually deliver and generate and develop. But I think that has to be underpinned, going back to what I've mentioned throughout. it has to be underpinned by an advance in the manufacturing capability, an advance in the manufacturing process understanding. And I think we will get there. I think, AI has taken the world by storm, ever since ChatGPT, burst onto the scene. And I think everyone's now realizing that actually there are leaps that we need to make, for example, in our sector, about how we utilize the data that we're generating, how we can utilize some of these AI, LLMs or whatever it might, what other models we might use, how we can utilize those tools to support with the data analysis, to support with, the idea of automated process control, and so on. So I think we will definitely see that as well. And then I think the final thing from my perspective is, I think we will continue to see a rise in the transformative nature of these therapies, and that's why I'm fully still 100% behind the work that we do in cell and gene therapy, because you can't see any other therapeutic modality that has the same clinical outcomes that we're able to achieve with the therapies that we have. And I think that is that is the number one reason why I think cell and gene therapies are not just a fad, they're not just here for a short while, but they will be here for the long run. And I think it will be they will play a significant part in redefining what the future of healthcare looks like. And I'm very excited to be a part of that. I hope the Catapult will continue to lead the way in that respect as well. And I think we've got a very exciting future ahead, even if we've had to overcome some of the bumps and challenges along the way.